They thought she would stay quiet because she was alone, but they forgot she was a mother. Emily Carter hadn't planned to be in a place like this, not on a Tuesday afternoon with only $32 left in her checking account and a 6-year-old boy holding her hand like she was the only thing keeping his world steady. But Noah had seen the Christmas lights through the mall windows and asked with that soft hopeful voice she could never say no to, so she borrowed time she didn't have and brought him here, into a world of polished marble floors and people who never looked down. Her sneakers squeaking slightly against the shine while her reflection reminded her she didn't belong, but Noah did, at least for a moment, his small fingers wrapped around hers, eyes wide at everything glowing and bright. "Mom, look," he whispered, pointing at a display of toy cars that probably cost more than her weekly groceries, and she smiled anyway. Because his happiness was worth pretending they could afford this life for just a few minutes, she let go of his hand for 1 second to grab a napkin from the cafe counter, just 1 second, and that was all it took. The coffee cup tipped, the dark liquid spilling across expensive leather shoes that looked like they had never known a stain. Silence fell too fast, too sharp, like the air itself pulled tight. Noah froze, his small body stiff, his voice barely there. "I'm sorry," he said, but the man didn't hear the apology, or maybe he did and didn't care. He looked down slowly, irritation flickering across his face like something beneath him had dared to exist. "Watch where you're going," the man said, not loud, but loud enough, the kind of voice that expected obedience. Noah stepped back, bumping into Emily's leg, and she felt it, that shift, that quiet trembling she knew too well, the way fear sat in a child's chest when the world suddenly felt too big, too harsh. She knelt instantly, one hand on Noah's shoulder, grounding him. "It's okay," she whispered. But the man wasn't finished. He brushed at his shoe like Noah had ruined something important, something valuable, something that mattered more than a child's apology. And then it happened, a small careless motion, a step too close. Noah lost his balance and stumbled. Not hard, not dramatic, but enough for Emily to feel something inside her snap clean in half. She stood up so fast her chair scraped behind her, her voice shaking but rising anyway. "He said he's sorry," she said, every word carrying more than just sound, carrying every sleepless night, every sacrifice, every moment she had held her son together alone. The man looked at her now, really looked, taking in her worn jacket, her tired eyes, the way she stood between him and her child like a wall built from nothing but will. And for a second, just 1 second, the entire mall seemed to pause, people watching, waiting, measuring the worth of a single mother against a man who clearly owned more than just his space. Emily didn't move, didn't step back, even as her heart pounded like it was trying to warn her, because some lines don't get crossed, not when it's your child, not when he's looking up at you like you are the only safe place left in the world, and somewhere above them, unseen, unnoticed, a man in a perfectly tailored suit stopped walking and turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto the scene below with a stillness that didn't belong to coincidence. Because he didn't look surprised, he looked interested, like he had just found something he hadn't known he was searching for. And when Emily Carter lifted her chin and refused to step aside, something in that moment shifted in a way no one there could yet understand. The man's expression did not change right away, and that was what made it worse, the calm indifference, the way he glanced down at Emily like she was a minor inconvenience instead of a person, like her voice did not belong in the same space as his. And for a moment Emily felt it, that familiar pressure to shrink, to apologize, to make things easier just to avoid trouble. But Noah's hand tightened in hers, small fingers trembling. And that was enough to hold her ground. "I said he is sorry," she repeated, steadier this time, her body angled just enough to shield her son. The man exhaled slowly, as if patience itself was a luxury he was being forced to spend. "Then teach him to be more careful," he replied, brushing past the moment like it was already over, like he had already decided how much they were worth. And the people around them shifted, some pretending not to watch, others watching too closely, phones slightly raised, capturing something that was not supposed to belong to them. Emily felt the heat rise in her chest, not anger alone but something deeper, something protective and immovable. "He is 6 years old," she said, each word clear, measured, refusing to shake now. "You do not talk to him like that." And that was when the air changed again. Not louder, not sharper, just heavier, like something unseen had stepped into the space between them. The man's eyes narrowed slightly, not because he was threatened, but because he was unused to resistance, especially from someone like her. "You are in the wrong place to make demands," he said quietly, and Emily understood exactly what he meant, not just the mall, but the entire world they were standing in. A world that had never been built for people like her, people who counted every dollar. People who worked 2 jobs and still came up short, people who had to ask permission just to exist comfortably in spaces like this. But she did not move, she could not, because Noah was still behind her, still looking at her like she was the answer to everything he did not understand, and somewhere above, Dominic Russo watched without blinking, his gaze fixed not on the man who spoke, but on the woman who refused to step back. There was something about her stillness, about the way she did not raise her voice yet did not lower it either, something that did not fit the pattern he knew so well. Most people either escalated or retreated, but she did neither. She simply stood, and that made him pause, because it was rare, and he noticed rare things. Down below, the man shifted his weight, impatience creeping in, as if the scene had already lasted longer than it should have. "This conversation is over," he said, turning slightly, dismissing her with the same casual authority he used for everything else, and that was the moment Noah's voice broke through, soft but clear. "Mom," he said, and Emily felt it again, that quiet fear, that question in his tone, asking if the world was about to hurt him again, and something inside her answered before she could think. "No," she said. Not to Noah, not even to the man, but to the situation itself, to the idea that this was how things had to be, and she took one small step forward, not aggressive, not reckless, just enough to be heard. "You do not get to walk away like this," she said, and this time people did not pretend not to watch. This time the silence held, stretched thin across polished floors and bright lights, and above it all, Dominic Russo moved. Just one step at first, then another, slow, deliberate, the kind of movement that did not need urgency because it already carried control, and though no one noticed him yet, something deeper in the room did, something instinctive, something that made conversations lower and attention shift without understanding why, because power does not always announce itself, sometimes it simply arrives, and when it does, everything else adjusts whether it wants to or not. The shift was subtle at first, almost invisible, but Emily felt it before she saw anything change, the way the noise of the mall dulled just slightly, the way a few heads turned not toward her but past her, as if something else had entered the space and quietly taken control without asking. The man in front of her noticed it too, his attention flickering for just a second over her shoulder, irritation breaking for the first time into something uncertain, and Emily almost turned, almost followed his gaze, but she did not, because Noah's hand was still in hers and that mattered more than anything else. "I said you do not get to walk away," she repeated, softer now but somehow stronger, and this time the words did not sound like a request, they sounded like a boundary, something drawn in place that would not move. The man let out a short breath, the kind that came from someone who was no longer in complete control of the situation, and before he could respond, another voice entered, calm, low, carrying through the space without effort. "She is right," it said, and everything stopped, not dramatically, not loudly, just completely, like a room that suddenly remembered how to listen. Emily turned then, slowly, her heart catching in her chest for reasons she could not explain, and she saw him, tall, composed, every detail precise without trying, a dark suit that fit like it had been made for him alone, eyes that did not rush, did not search, they simply arrived and stayed. Dominic Russo did not raise his voice, did not step too quickly, he just walked forward with the kind of presence that made space for him before he even reached it. People moved without realizing why, a path opening naturally as if the world itself had decided to cooperate. The man who had been speaking straightened slightly, recognition flashing across his face too late to hide. "Mr. Russo," he said, his tone shifting instantly, respect layered over something tighter, something careful. Dominic did not look at him right away, his attention moved first to Emily, then to Noah, a brief pause, just enough to take in what mattered, the small hand still gripping his mother's, the way she stood between him and everything else without hesitation, and something in that image settled into place, something that made his next words quieter but heavier. "A child apologizes," Dominic said, finally turning his gaze to the man, "and you respond by making him feel smaller." He tilted his head just slightly, not aggressive, not confrontational, just certain. "That is not how this works." The man swallowed, his posture shifting again, less certain now, less anchored. "It was an accident," he said quickly, as if correcting the narrative might still give him ground to stand on. Dominic nodded once, slow, measured. Yes, he replied, it was. And the agreement should have ended it, should have released the tension, but it did not, because the silence that followed carried weight, expectation, consequence that had not yet been spoken. Emily felt it in the way Noah's grip loosened just slightly, confusion replacing fear, as if he sensed something had changed even if he did not understand what. Dominic took one more step forward, close enough now that his presence was no longer distant, no longer abstract, it was real, immediate, and when he spoke again, it was directed only at the man. Each word placed with precision. So you will fix it, he said, not as a question, not as a suggestion, but as something already decided, and for the first time since this began, the man hesitated completely, his confidence pausing in a way that had nothing to do with Emily and everything to do with the person standing in front of him, because some authority is given. And some authority is taken, but this kind, the kind Dominic carried, did not need either, it simply existed, and the room understood that before anyone said it out loud. The silence stretched just long enough to feel deliberate, like the entire moment was being weighed before it was allowed to move forward, and the man standing across from Dominic felt it more than anyone, the pressure of expectation settling in a way he could not ignore, his eyes flickering briefly toward the people watching, toward the subtle shift in attention that no longer belonged to him, and when he looked back, it was different, less certain, less controlled. Of course, he said. Finally, the words coming quicker than before, like he was trying to regain something that had already slipped, and he turned slightly, his gaze dropping to Noah for the first time without irritation, without dismissal, but still unsure, still unfamiliar with what this moment required. Emily felt Noah press closer to her side, his fingers tightening again, not out of fear this time, but out of uncertainty, and she knelt beside him instinctively, bringing herself down to his level, her voice softer now. You are okay, she whispered, brushing a hand gently over his hair, grounding him, reminding him that he was not alone, that he had not done anything wrong, and above them, Dominic watched that interaction closely, not with curiosity, but with recognition, like he understood something about it that did not need to be explained. The man cleared his throat, the sound small compared to everything else around it. I apologize, he said, the words directed at Noah, careful, measured. Like they were unfamiliar territory, and for a second, no one moved, no one spoke, because this was not the kind of apology people expected to see in places like this, not from someone like him. Noah blinked, surprised, his small voice barely above a whisper. It is okay, he replied, and the simplicity of it, the honesty, seemed to shift the air again, softer this time, less tense. Like something had been restored even if only slightly. Dominic gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, but enough to mark the end of that part of the moment, and just like that, the weight lifted, not entirely, but enough for movement to return, for conversations to start again in hushed tones, for people to look away as if they had not just witnessed something they would remember later. Emily stood slowly, her hand still resting protectively on Noah's shoulder, her heart still racing even as everything around her began to normalize, and then she realized something. Dominic Russo was still there, still watching, not the situation now, but her, and it was not the kind of look she had expected. There was no judgment, no distance, just a quiet assessment that felt far more personal than it should have been. And for the first time since this began, Emily felt unsure, not of herself, but of him, of why he had stepped in, of why someone like him would notice someone like her at all. Thank you, she said finally, the words simple but sincere, because regardless of everything else, he had changed what could have been a very different ending. Dominic did not respond immediately, his gaze shifting briefly to Noah, then back to her, as if confirming something internally before speaking. You did not need help, he said, his voice calm, steady, but you deserved it anyway, and the words stayed with her longer than they should have, settling somewhere deeper than just the moment itself, because they did not feel like something said out of obligation, they felt intentional, and that made them heavier, more meaningful. Noah looked up at him then, curiosity replacing everything else. Are you a police officer? He asked, innocent, direct. And for the first time, something changed in Dominic's expression, not a smile exactly, but something softer, something less guarded. No, he replied simply, and that answer seemed to carry more than it revealed. Emily let out a quiet breath she did not realize she had been holding. the tension finally easing from her shoulders, but the feeling did not fully disappear, because as Dominic stepped back, giving space again without losing presence, there was a sense that this moment was not finished, not really, that something had begun here that neither of them fully understood yet, and as Emily took Noah's hand and turned slightly toward the exit, she could still feel it, that awareness, that quiet connection that had formed without permission, without warning, and when she glanced back one last time, Dominic was still standing there, exactly where he had been, watching her leave like it mattered, like she mattered, and that was the part she could not explain. Emily did not realize how tightly she had been holding Noah's hand until they stepped outside the mall and the cool air brushed against her face, grounding her in a way the polished floors and bright lights never could, the noise behind them fading into something distant, something unreal, like the entire moment they had just lived through belonged to someone else, but Noah was still quiet, still close, and that told her everything she needed to know. She crouched slightly as they reached the sidewalk, her voice gentle, steady. "Hey," she said softly, brushing her thumb across the back of his hand, "look at me," and he did, slowly, his eyes searching hers not for answers, but for reassurance. "Did I do something wrong?" he asked, and the question hit harder than anything that had happened inside, because it was not about the spill, it was about the way the world had reacted to him. The way a stranger had made him feel small for a mistake. Emily shook her head immediately, firm. "Certain, no," she said, her voice stronger now, unwavering. "You did not do anything wrong, accidents happen, that is how we learn." She paused just long enough to make sure he heard her, really heard her. "And you said you were sorry, that matters." Noah nodded slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just a little, and she pulled him into a quick hug, not too long, just enough to remind him that he was safe, that he was seen, that he mattered. When she stood again, she felt it, that strange awareness lingering at the edge of her thoughts, the sense of being watched, not in a threatening way, but in a way that made her aware of herself, of the moment, and she did not need to turn to know who it was. Dominic Russo had not followed them, not physically, but his presence still felt close, like something unfinished had been left behind. "Mom," Noah said again, his voice lighter now, curious instead of afraid, "why did that man listen to him?" Emily hesitated, just for a second, because there were 100 answers she could give and none of them felt right for a 6-year-old. She chose the simplest truth she could shape. "Some people carry a kind of respect that others understand," she said, carefully, guiding him toward the crosswalk, "and when they speak, people listen." Noah considered that, his small hand swinging slightly with hers as they walked. "Is he a good person?" he asked, and this time Emily did not answer right away, because she did not know, not really, she only knew what she had seen, the way he had stepped in without hesitation, the way he had looked at her, not with pity, not with superiority, but with something she could not quite name, something steady. "Something deliberate, I think," she said slowly, choosing each word. "He is someone who knows when something is not right," and that seemed to satisfy Noah for now. He nodded and looked ahead, already distracted by something else, already moving forward the way children do, but Emily was not as quick to let it go, because as they reached the corner and waited for the light to change, she glanced back, just once, just to confirm what she already felt, and there he was, still inside the glass walls of the mall, standing exactly where she had left him, not surrounded, not distracted, just there, his attention still on her, not intense, not intrusive, just present, and for a brief moment, their eyes met again through the distance, through the reflections and passing figures, and something in that silent exchange lingered longer than it should have, longer than made sense, and when the light turned green and Emily turned away, guiding Noah across the street, she carried that feeling with her, not fear, not comfort, something in between, something unfamiliar, because some encounters end when you walk away, but others, the rare ones, begin the moment you think they are over, and Emily Carter had no way of knowing that this was one of them. Dominic Russo did not move right away after Emily disappeared into the flow of the city. He remained where he was, still and composed, as if the moment had not fully released him yet, the glass walls of the mall reflecting fragments of passing people while his focus stayed fixed on something no longer there, and around him, the world resumed its rhythm, conversations returned, footsteps echoed, but none of it seemed to touch him, because his attention had already shifted beyond the surface. "Who is she?" he asked quietly, not turning, not needing to, and the man beside Him, who had approached without drawing notice, paused just slightly before answering. "We can find out," he said, careful, respectful, because he understood the tone. This was not casual curiosity, this was interest, and interest from Dominic Russo was never random. Dominic exhaled slowly, his gaze lowering for a brief moment as if replaying something, not the confrontation, not the apology, but the way Emily had stood her ground without raising her voice, the way she had chosen to protect. Without asking for anything in return, that was what stayed, that was what mattered. "No rush," he replied finally, his voice calm, controlled, "but I want to know," and that was enough. It always was. The man beside him nodded once and stepped back, already understanding what would follow, because when Dominic noticed something, it did not get forgotten, it got followed. Outside, Emily and Noah reached the bus stop just as the evening light softened into something quieter, the kind of glow that made everything feel slower, more reflective. Noah sat on the bench swinging his legs, his earlier tension gone, replaced by the natural ease of a child who had already moved on, but Emily had not. Her thoughts lingered, circling back to the same moment over and over, the voice, the presence, the way everything had shifted when he stepped in. She had seen confidence before, she had seen authority, but this had been different, quieter, heavier, like something that did not need to prove itself. "Mom," Noah said, looking up at her again, "do you think we will see him again?" The question caught her off guard, not because it was unexpected, but because she had already asked herself the same thing, and she did not know why it mattered. "I do not know," she answered honestly, sitting beside him, her hands resting loosely in her lap. "Some people you meet once and never again." She paused, her gaze drifting toward the street where cars passed in steady lines, "and some people," she added more quietly, "show up again when you least expect it." Noah seemed to accept that, nodding as if it made perfect sense, because to him, the world was still simple enough to believe that things happened for reasons, even if he did not understand them yet. The bus arrived with a soft hiss, doors opening as Emily stood and guided him forward. Her routine taking over, her focus shifting back to what she knew, what she could control, getting home, making dinner, making sure tomorrow looked like today in all the ways that mattered. But even as she stepped onto the bus, even as she found a seat by the window and pulled Noah close beside her, that feeling remained, subtle but persistent, like a thread she could not quite see but could still feel pulling somewhere just out of reach, and miles away, in a part of the city she had never been. 2. Dominic stepped into a waiting car, the door closing with quiet finality as he settled into the seat, his expression unchanged, unreadable, but his mind already moving forward, not on the man from earlier, not on the situation that had already resolved itself, but on her, on Emily Carter, because something about the way she had stood there, alone yet unshaken, had not left him. And as the car pulled away from the curb, blending seamlessly into the city that belonged to him in ways few would ever understand, one thought remained clear, simple, and certain: this was not the end of that moment, it was only the beginning. The bus ride home felt longer than usual, not because of traffic or noise, but because Emily could not quiet the thoughts that kept replaying in her mind, small details looping in a way that made them feel bigger than they should have been, the way his voice had cut through everything without effort, the way the entire room had shifted without anyone being told to move, and most of all, the way he had looked at her, not past her, not through her, but at her, like she was something worth noticing, something worth stepping in for. She had spent years being invisible in crowded places, just another tired mother counting every dollar and every minute, but today had been different, and that difference stayed with her in a way she could not ignore. Beside her, Noah leaned against the window, watching the city blur by in streaks of light and shadow, his earlier questions replaced by quiet curiosity. "Mom," he said softly, his voice cutting gently through her thoughts, "do you think he knows us?" Emily blinked, pulled back into the present. "No," she said, though the answer felt less certain than it should have. "People like him do not usually know people like us." Noah considered that, tilting his head slightly. "But he helped us," he pointed out, simple and direct, and Emily did not have an answer for that, not one that made sense in the world she understood. "Sometimes," she said slowly, choosing her words carefully, "people help because it is the right thing to do, not because they know you." Noah nodded, accepting that easily. Because children did not question kindness the way adults did, they just received it and moved on. The bus came to a stop near their street, and Emily stood, guiding him off with practiced ease, the familiar rhythm of home beginning to settle back into place. Their apartment building came into view, small, worn, but steady, the kind of place that held more stories than it showed. She unlocked the door, stepping inside with Noah close behind her, the quiet of the space wrapping around them like a reset button. Something safe, something known. She moved through the routine automatically, setting down her bag, checking the kitchen, making sure everything was in place. But even here, in the comfort of what she knew, her thoughts did not fully settle, because something had shifted today, something she could not yet name. Miles away, Dominic sat in the back of his car as it moved through the city with smooth precision, the skyline stretching past the window like a map he already understood. His phone buzzed once, a message arriving with the efficiency he expected. He glanced down briefly, the information concise, direct, exactly what he had asked for. Emily Carter, age 28, single mother, one child. Noah Carter, 6 years old, part-time work, limited income, no history that stood out, nothing remarkable on paper, and yet, he looked at the screen a second longer than necessary, because what he had seen earlier did not match what he was reading now. There was nothing ordinary about the way she had stood there, about the way she had refused to be pushed aside, and that discrepancy held his attention. His thumb hovered for a moment before he locked the screen, setting the phone aside, his gaze returning to the city outside, thoughtful, measured, because information told one story, but presence told another, and he trusted presence more. The car slowed as it approached a stoplight, the red glow reflecting briefly across his face, and for a moment, everything stilled again, not in the world around him, but within it, because some encounters were easy to dismiss, easy to categorize and forget, but this one was not. And as the light changed and the car moved forward once more, one thing became clear in a way that did not need to be spoken. Emily Carter was not going to disappear back into the background of his world. Not anymore. Morning came quietly, the kind of soft light that slipped through thin curtains and settled gently across the small apartment, and for a moment, everything felt normal again, routine wrapping around Emily like a shield she had learned to rely on. She moved through the kitchen with practiced rhythm, pouring cereal into a bowl, checking the clock, mentally calculating the day ahead, school drop-off, work shift, groceries if the numbers allowed it, the usual cycle that left little room for anything unexpected. Noah sat at the table swinging his legs, his earlier fear gone, replaced by the simple focus of a child thinking about school and friends and things that did not carry weight yet. "Mom," he said between bites, "do you think that man wakes up early too?" Emily paused, the question catching her mid-motion. She almost smiled at how children connected things in ways adults never would. "I do not know," she answered, setting a glass of milk in front of him. "Maybe." Noah nodded. Like that made sense, like it completed something in his mind, and then he moved on, already thinking about something else. But Emily did not move on as easily, because even here, in the quiet of her own kitchen, that moment from yesterday had not fully let go. It lingered, not loud, not intrusive, just present, like a memory that refused to fade into the background. Across the city, Dominic stood near a floor-to-ceiling window, the skyline stretching endlessly beyond him, his office silent. Except for the faint hum of distant activity, his attention not on the view, not on the files spread across his desk, but on something else entirely, something that did not belong to his usual world. A soft knock broke the stillness, and without turning, he spoke. "Come in." The door opened smoothly, his associate stepping inside with the kind of quiet efficiency that came from understanding unspoken expectations. "Everything you asked for is confirmed," he said, placing a thin folder on the desk. Dominic turned then, his gaze dropping briefly to the file before lifting again, and, the man added carefully, "Nothing unusual beyond what we already know." Dominic gave a small nod, but his expression did not shift, because what he had seen yesterday had not been about background or records. It had been about something else, something harder to define. "Set something up," he said after a moment, his voice even, controlled, not direct. He added, his gaze steady, "I want to see how she moves through her world when she does not think anyone is watching." The man hesitated for just a fraction of a second, not questioning, but recognizing the difference in this request. "Understood," he replied, stepping back as quietly as he had entered, leaving Dominic alone again with the silence that seemed to follow him everywhere. Back in the apartment, Emily grabbed her keys, guiding Noah toward the door, the familiar rush of morning settling in. backpacks, shoes, reminders, small things that filled the space between thoughts, but as she stepped outside, locking the door behind her, she felt it again, that same subtle awareness from the day before, faint but unmistakable, like the air had shifted just slightly. She glanced down the street, nothing out of place, nothing that should have drawn her attention. And yet, the feeling remained, not threatening, not clear, just there, and she pushed it aside, because she had to, because her world did not allow for distractions that could not be explained. She took Noah's hand, walking toward the bus stop with steady steps, unaware that across the street, behind tinted windows that reflected nothing back, a car sat parked just long enough to observe, just long enough to confirm, and inside, a pair of eyes watched quietly, not with urgency, not with judgment, but with the same calm focus. That had changed everything the day before, because some stories do not begin when two people meet, they begin when one of them decides the meeting was not enough, and Dominic Russo had already made that decision. Emily tried to ignore the feeling as the morning unfolded, the quiet sense that something had shifted just beyond what she could see. She walked Noah to school, knelt to fix the strap of his backpack, smoothed his hair the way she always did, grounding both of them in something familiar. "Have a good day," she said softly, and he smiled, already turning toward the entrance, already letting go of yesterday in the effortless way children could. She watched him disappear into the building before straightening, her eyes scanning the street without meaning to. Everything looked the same, parents rushing, cars passing, nothing out of place, and yet, the awareness lingered, subtle but persistent, like a thread pulling somewhere just beneath the surface. She shook it off and turned toward the bus stop. Her shift would start in 30 minutes, and she could not afford to be late. Across the street, the black car remained parked for just a moment longer before pulling away smoothly, blending into traffic without leaving a trace. Inside, the man in the passenger seat spoke quietly into his phone, his voice measured, precise. "Routine confirmed," he said, "no deviations." There was a pause as he listened, then a nod no one else could see. Understood. He ended the call and glanced once more in the direction Emily had gone, not with curiosity, but with the kind of attention that came from following instructions that did not need to be repeated. Miles away, Dominic listened to the report without interrupting, his gaze resting on the city below him, the morning light cutting clean lines across glass and steel. "And the child?" he asked after a moment, his tone unchanged. "He is fine," came the response. "School, normal schedule." Dominic nodded once, ending the call without another word, his attention shifting inward, not to strategy, not to business, but to something quieter, something less defined, because what he was observing was not a threat, not a risk, it was a pattern, a life moving forward without awareness of the space it had entered. Back on the street, Emily reached the cafe where she worked, pushing the door open as the familiar scent of coffee and baked bread wrapped around her, grounding her again in something she understood, something predictable. "You are late," her manager called from behind the counter, not harsh, just tired, and Emily gave a quick apology, tying her apron as she moved into position, the routine taking over, orders, smiles, small conversations that filled the hours without asking too much from her. But even here, even surrounded by noise and movement, that feeling did not completely disappear. It stayed at the edges, faint but steady, like a quiet reminder that something had changed whether she understood it or not. The bell above the door chimed softly, and Emily glanced up out of habit, her eyes scanning the next customer, and for a second, just 1 second, her breath caught, not because of who walked in, but because of what she felt, that same shift, that same subtle stillness pressing lightly against the moment. The man who entered was ordinary at first glance, dressed simply, nothing that stood out, but the way he paused, the way his eyes moved briefly across the room before settling, felt deliberate, controlled. Emily blinked, telling herself she was imagining it, that not every stranger carried meaning, not every moment needed to connect back to yesterday. She forced her focus back to the register, to the order in front of her, to the normalcy she depended on, but somewhere deeper, something had already noticed. Something had already begun to question, and far above it all, Dominic stood once more at his window, the city stretching endlessly beneath him, and for the first time in a long time, his attention was not on what he controlled, but on something that moved outside of it, something small, quiet, but impossible to ignore, because once you notice something that does not fit your world, you have two choices: you forget it, or you follow it. And Dominic Russo had never been the kind of man who forgot. Emily kept her focus on the register, on the steady rhythm of orders and receipts, because that was how she kept control, by narrowing her world down to what she could see and touch. Medium latte, 1 sugar, she repeated, her voice calm, practiced, her hands moving automatically as she worked, but the feeling did not leave, it stayed just beneath the surface, subtle but persistent, like a quiet shift in the air that refused to settle back into normal. The man who had walked in did not step forward right away. He lingered near the entrance just long enough to observe, his posture relaxed, unremarkable, but his eyes attentive in a way that did not match the casual setting. Emily noticed it again, not consciously at first, more like instinct, the kind that made her glance up one more time than necessary, and when their eyes briefly met, he gave a small nod, polite, nothing unusual, and yet it felt deliberate, like a signal she did not understand. She looked away quickly, telling herself it meant nothing, that she was letting yesterday affect how she saw everything today. Next, her manager called, and the line moved forward, pulling her back into the moment, pulling her away from thoughts she could not afford to follow. The man stepped up to the counter, his voice even controlled. "Black coffee," he said, simple, direct, and Emily nodded, entering the order without comment, but as she handed him the cup, her fingers brushed the edge of his for just a second, and something about that contact felt different, not wrong, not uncomfortable, just aware, like a connection that existed only long enough to be noticed and then gone. "Thank you," he said, his tone neutral, but his eyes lingered for a fraction longer than necessary, as if confirming something, as if completing a task, and then he stepped aside, taking a seat near the window, positioning himself where he could see the room without being the center of it. Outside, the city moved on without pause, cars passing, people rushing, everything continuing as it always did, but inside, a quiet observation had begun, measured, controlled. Back in the car a few blocks away, another phone buzzed, the update short, precise, contact established. The voice on the other end said, "No suspicion." There was a pause, then a single response, calm and certain, "Continue." Dominic ended the call and leaned back slightly, his gaze steady, thoughtful, because this was not about urgency, not about action, it was about understanding, about watching how something unfolded when it was not being forced. Back in the cafe, Emily moved through the next hour with steady focus, but the awareness never fully faded. It stayed just enough to remind her that something was off, not wrong, just different. She caught herself glancing toward the window more than once, each time finding the man still there, still quiet, still observing without appearing to do so, and with each glance, the feeling grew clearer, not fear, not danger, but attention, intentional and patient, and that was what unsettled her the most, because attention like that was not accidental, it meant purpose, it meant choice, and Emily Carter had lived long enough to know that when someone chose to notice you, it was never random, it was the beginning of something, whether you wanted it to be or not. And as the afternoon light shifted slowly across the cafe floor, stretching shadows in long quiet lines, she realized something she had not allowed herself to think before. This was not just a passing moment, not something that would fade by tomorrow. Whatever had started yesterday was still moving, still unfolding, and she was already part of it, even if she did not understand how or why yet. And somewhere above it all, Dominic Russo stood once more in silence, watching the city that moved according to rules he understood completely, except for one thing, the one thing he had chosen not to ignore, because sometimes the smallest disruptions were the ones that changed everything, and he had already decided, this one was worth following to the end. By the time the afternoon rush slowed, Emily could no longer pretend the feeling was only in her head. It had settled into something clearer now, not overwhelming, not urgent, but steady, like a presence that did not need to announce itself to be understood. She wiped down the counter slowly, her movements automatic, but her attention split, half on the task, half on the quiet awareness that had not left her since morning. The man by the window was still there, his coffee long finished, his posture unchanged, patient in a way that did not match someone simply passing time, and that was what finally pushed her to act, not fear, not panic, just a need to understand. She turned to her manager briefly. "I will be back in a minute," she said, her voice even, and before she could second-guess herself, she stepped out from behind the counter and walked toward him, each step measured, grounded, refusing to let uncertainty show. When she reached the table, she stopped just far enough to keep distance, her hands loosely at her sides. "You have been here for a while," she said, not accusing, not soft, just direct. The man looked up slowly, as if he had been expecting this moment, his expression calm, almost neutral, but there was something in his eyes that confirmed what she already knew. This was not random. "I have," he replied, his tone polite, controlled. "Is there something I can help you with?" she asked, and the question hung there, simple on the surface but carrying more beneath it, because she was not asking about coffee, not really. The man studied her for a brief second, not invasive, not uncomfortable, just precise, like he was measuring how much to reveal. "No," he said finally, just observing. The word landed quietly, but it carried weight, enough to confirm what she had already felt. Emily held his gaze a moment longer, her expression steady. "People do not usually observe strangers without a reason," she said, and this time there was a slight shift in his posture, not defensive, not tense, just acknowledging the truth in her words. "You are right," he admitted, and for the first time, there was the smallest trace of something else in his voice, not emotion, but intention. "Then what is the reason?" Emily asked, her voice lower now, more focused, because she needed clarity. Even if she was not sure she wanted the answer, the man did not respond immediately, his eyes flicking briefly toward the window before returning to her, and when he spoke, his words were careful, chosen. "Someone noticed you," he said, and that was it. No explanation, no name, just enough to shift everything again. Emily felt her breath catch, not out of fear, but out of recognition, because there was only one person that could mean, the memory of yesterday rising instantly, clear, undeniable. "Why?" she asked, softer now, the question no longer directed at the man in front of her, but at the situation itself, at the invisible line she had crossed without knowing it. The man shook his head slightly. "That is not for me to say," he replied, standing slowly, his movements unhurried, controlled. "But you should know," he added, pausing just long enough to meet her eyes again. "Being noticed by someone like him changes things." The statement was not a warning, not a threat, just a fact delivered without emotion, without exaggeration, and that was what made it settle deeper. Emily stood there for a moment after he walked past her, the space around her suddenly quieter, heavier, like the air itself had shifted again. She did not follow him, did not call him back, because something told her there was nothing more he would say, not here, not now, and as she turned slowly, her eyes drifting toward the window where he had been sitting, she realized something she could no longer ignore. This was not something she could step away from, not something she could return to normal and forget, because the moment she had been noticed, truly noticed, her world had already begun to change, and somewhere across the city, Dominic Rousseau stood in silence, his gaze steady, his decision already made. Because noticing was never the end for him, it was always the beginning. Emily stood there for a moment longer than she should have, the noise of the cafe slowly returning around her like nothing had changed, like the last few minutes had not quietly shifted the ground beneath her feet. She moved back behind the counter on instinct, her hands reaching for tasks she had done 100 times before, but her mind was somewhere else entirely, replaying the words she had just heard. "Someone noticed you." The sentence echoed not as a threat, but as something heavier. Something that carried consequences she could not yet see. "Emily," her manager called, snapping her back. "Table 3 needs their order." She nodded quickly, forcing herself into motion, because standing still would only make it worse. She prepared the drinks, delivered them, smiled when expected, but everything felt slightly off, like she was moving through a version of her life that no longer fit the same way. When her shift finally ended, the relief she usually felt did not come. Instead, there was a quiet tension, a sense that stepping outside would not return things to normal, it would only bring her closer to whatever this was becoming. She untied her apron slowly, her fingers pausing for just a second before she grabbed her bag and headed toward the door. The evening air met her again, cooler now, the city shifting into its nighttime rhythm, and for a moment she just stood there, taking it in, grounding herself before moving forward. She needed to pick up Noah, needed to focus on what mattered, but as she stepped onto the sidewalk, she felt it immediately, not the vague awareness from before, but something clearer, more defined. She was not alone in this moment. She did not turn right away, she did not want to confirm it, because once she did, it would be real, and real meant something she could not ignore. "You should not be standing still," a voice said behind her, calm, familiar in a way that made her chest tighten before she even turned, and when she did, slowly, deliberately, there he was, Dominic Russo, exactly as she remembered, composed, still, his presence filling the space without effort, without asking. Her breath caught for just a second, not out of fear, but out of the sudden realization that everything the man inside had said was true. This was not distant, this was not abstract, this was here, now. I thought that was you, he continued, his voice even, as if this meeting had been expected, as if it had already been decided long before she stepped outside. Emily straightened slightly, instinctively holding her ground the same way she had before, but this was different. This was not a public confrontation, this was personal, direct, and that made it harder to navigate. You had someone watching me, she said. Not accusing, not soft, just stating what she now understood. Dominic did not deny it, did not deflect. I had someone observe, he corrected calmly, his eyes steady on hers. There is a difference, and somehow, the way he said it made that difference feel real, intentional, controlled. Emily crossed her arms slightly, not defensive, but grounding herself. Why? She asked again, the same question from before, but now directed at the only person who could answer it. Dominic did not respond immediately, his gaze shifting briefly, not away, but inward, as if choosing the exact truth he was willing to give. Because you did not ask for help, he said finally, his voice lower now, more deliberate, and that is rare. The answer was not what she expected, not a reason tied to power or control, but something else, something that felt almost personal. Emily frowned slightly, trying to understand. That is not a reason to follow someone, she said, her tone firm, and for a moment there was silence between them, not empty, but full, like something unspoken was being measured. Dominic took a small step closer, not invading, not threatening, just enough to close the distance into something intentional. No, he agreed quietly, but it is a reason to know who they are. His words settled into the space between them, not forceful, not demanding, just certain, and Emily realized then that this was not about yesterday, not really. It was about what he had seen in that moment, something she had not even been aware she was showing, and that realization shifted everything again, because being seen like that, truly seen, was not something she had ever planned for. And as the city moved around them, lights flickering on, shadows stretching longer across the pavement, one truth became impossible to ignore. This was no longer something happening around her. It was something she was standing in the center of, and Dominic Russo was no longer just a man she had met once. He was now part of her world, whether she wanted that or not. Emily did not step back when he moved closer, but she did not move forward either. She held her ground in that narrow space between retreat and surrender, her eyes steady on his, searching for something she could define, something she could understand, because nothing about this felt simple anymore. Knowing who I am does not give you a place in my life, she said quietly, her voice controlled but firm, and for a moment, the city noise around them seemed to fade again, like it had before, like something about their presence together altered the rhythm of everything else. Dominic studied her without interruption, not offended, not surprised, just attentive, as if her resistance was expected, even necessary. I am not asking for a place, he replied calmly, his tone measured. I am acknowledging one already exists. The words settled between them with a weight that did not need to be explained, and Emily felt it. That shift again, deeper this time, because this was no longer about curiosity, it was about intention. You do not get to decide that, she said, her brows drawing slightly, her grip tightening around the strap of her bag, and for the first time, there was a pause in Dominic's response, not hesitation, but consideration, like he was adjusting something internally. No, he said after a moment, his voice lower now, but I do decide what I do with what I see. And there it was. Not control over her, but control over himself, over his actions, his choices, and somehow that distinction made the moment more real, more grounded. Emily let out a slow breath, her thoughts racing faster than she could sort them, because part of her wanted to walk away, to end this before it became something she could not manage, but another part, quieter, more dangerous, wanted to understand why someone like him would step into her world at all. I have a son, she said finally, her voice softer but no less certain. My life is not something you observe or step into whenever you decide it is interesting. Dominic's gaze shifted slightly at that, not away, but deeper, as if her words had reached something more than just the surface. I know, he said simply, and the way he said it, without explanation, without detail, made it clear he meant it, not just as information, but as understanding. Then you understand why this stops here, Emily continued, her tone steady again, drawing a line she needed him to see, to respect. The silence that followed was different this time, not tense, not uncertain, just full, like something was being decided without being spoken. Dominic nodded once, slow, deliberate. If that is what you want, he said, and the answer was exactly what she had asked for, exactly what she should have felt relieved to hear, and yet, something about it did not feel final, did not feel closed, because the way he said it carried something else beneath it, something patient, something that did not rush to conclusions. Emily held his gaze for one last moment, searching again for something she could name, something that would make this make sense, but all she found was certainty. Not about her, but about himself, about whatever this was becoming. She turned then, finally, taking a step back, then another, putting distance between them the only way she knew how, physically, tangibly, and for a second, she thought that would be enough, that stepping away would return her to something normal. But as she walked down the sidewalk, the city moving around her once more, she felt it again, not behind her, not following, but still there, that quiet awareness, that invisible thread that had not broken when she turned away, and she realized something she had not been ready to admit before. Some encounters do not end when you walk away from them, some simply change form, and as Dominic remained where he was, watching her leave without calling her back, without stepping forward again, his expression unchanged, his presence steady, one thought remained, clear and unshaken: she could walk away from him, but she would not walk out of his world, not anymore, because the moment he had seen her, truly seen her, something had already begun, and beginnings like that did not ask for permission to continue.